Some years ago, I had a spiritual director who turned to me and said, "Figure it out is not one of the 10 Commandments." When we have an encounter with God or read about an encounter with God, we want to figure it out. We want to understand it. We want to just understand everything about it. And we begin to sort of gnaw at it and want to understand. When I was first ordained, I led a Bible study, and we were talking about a difficult passage in the Bible. And I had this woman who finally turned to me and said, "Just tell me what it says, what it means, and what I should believe." And I realized, for all my education and all my ancient Greek and biblical Hebrew, all I could tell her was what I believed. And sometimes I wasn't even certain that that was certain. We have these encounters with God that sometimes befuddle us. And we want to understand them, which is only human. And yet sometimes our understanding becomes so clouded that we don't know which way to go and how to understand it. In our gospel reading this morning in Mark, the disciples had the most bizarre encounter with God, and thank heavens they were so confused that when Jesus said, "Just don't tell anybody what you have just seen," they were probably relieved, because they too couldn't figure it out and how to explain it and what was certain and what was not. Jesus had led James and John and Peter up a mountain, which we think is Mount Hebron. And when they got to the top, it was almost dark, and they began to pray. The disciples got sleepier and sleepier until all of a sudden there was this bright light that shone through their sleepy eyes that was brighter than anything they could ever imagine. And there was Jesus, just shining brighter than an incandescent light bulb. And his face was glowing, and he was talking to Elijah and Moses as if they were old friends. Peter, not knowing what to say or to do, said, "Oh, Master, let's build 3 booths. How about we put 3 tents up?" As if he was offering them a cup of tea. And then a great big cloud came through, a huge, dense fog. And the shining lights then just evaporated. They heard a voice that said, "This is my Son, my beloved. Listen to him." And then the cloud dissipated, and no one was left there but Jesus, looking as normal as anything. And then they traipsed down the mountain to a regular earth. And the disciples didn't quite understand any of what they had just seen, and perhaps at the resurrection they understood more. But until then, they were relieved not to be able to tell anybody that, because they themselves couldn't understand it. In the Gospel of Mark, in the last few readings, we started with the first chapter of Mark and in the beginning of Jesus' ministry amongst the people. And then all of a sudden, here we are on the Sunday of Transfiguration, where we're literally in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. We've been through the chapters of the healing and the liberation and the freedom and the proclamation of Jesus'. And then we have this mountaintop experience. And then the rest of Mark and the rest of the chapters of Mark are about the passion and the walk toward the crucifixion and Jerusalem. This Sunday is Ash Wednesday. This Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, when we begin the time of Lent. It is during this time that we look at the encounters that we have had with God and try to understand them. But sometimes we too are befuddled and confused by a cloud. We read in the Bible the different encounters that different people have had with God. Moses and the burning bush, and yet I walk by a bush every day and don't feel that heat. Each of us has an understanding of God that sometimes we can't explain, and sometimes we ourselves don't understand. But somehow we get this glimmer shining through the befuddlement that we know in our hearts that that too is God, that we have been touched by God. Many summers I spent on Mount Desert Island, which is up in the coast of Maine. And there were some summers when the fog was so thick that we thought we'd never seen the sun again. We'd have house guests who came who would say, "How come I don't see anything?" Because the fog was so thick. And we would literally drive them around the island of Mount Desert and show up postcards and say, well, if you didn't see the fog, you could see in the postcard, this is what you'd be seeing. You'd see the mountains, or you'd see the ocean, or whatever. As we would go hiking in the mountains of Acadia, the national park on Mount Desert Island, there are rocks set along the paths that are called cairns. At first I didn't quite understand what they were there for, as if some dwarf had just decided to have a holy place there, until one day we were up at the top of a mountain and we were enveloped in fog, having no idea which way to go. And then we realized that the cairns, the piles of stone, were there to guide us back down home. And you could just barely see every 6 to 12 feet a cairn, and we would trace it as we walked the paths down. Thank heavens for those cairns. Those postcards, if you will, of guidance as we walked down. Many times you've heard that our spiritual faith is like a journey. And there are times when we are in the midst of a cloud or a fog and have no idea which way to go. This Lent, notice the cairns, the markers in your life that are leading you to a way. Read the Bible, pray, as if they too were postcards trying to illumine what and how we are to get out of the fog of misbelief and disbelief. It was Karl Barth who once said that miracles are a combination of belief and disbelief that take us from doubt to astonishment. When we try to be certain about something, it loses its wonder. It loses its mystique, its mystery. And yet we have the cairns, the postcards, that take us from one to other as we journey through this day. Some days, sometimes the clouds will part, and sometimes we will barely be able to see God in the midst of it all. But let it be a season of astonishment as we notice God's miracles, God's encounters with us, as we too walk toward Jerusalem and the passion of Christ. Amen.